Hi, my name is David Schultz, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the history of school desegregation in the United States. I'm going to begin with an overview of that history, and I'm going to go into some of the failures of school desegregation. Then, finally, I'm going to provide some policy suggestions based on the lessons we've learned from the failures of school desegregation in the United States, and I'm going to provide policy suggestions specifically concerning ability tracking and school choice and the proliferation of charter schools. To begin with, it's helpful to break down the history of school desegregation into different steps, different stages. And Harvey Wilkinson, in his paper on the Supreme Court and school desegregation, he breaks this process down into 5 steps, which are absolute defiance, token compliance, modest integration, massive integration, and then finally resegregation. And really one of the common threads that goes through all of this is gradualism, which is this sort of slower approach to school desegregation through the courts. So I'm going to really focus on some of the major court cases, starting with Brown versus the Board of Education, which stated that separate was inherently unequal and that it stated that students, Black students, needed to be admitted into white schools on a non-discriminatory basis, but it stipulated that this could be done with deliberate speed, which was a vague terminology left up to interpretation by recalcitrant states. This set up the stage for massive resistance. So we start with absolute defiance. That was the first stage, and you can really see that in Virginia, where there was massive resistance in a segregated private school system, where the governor was closing down and seizing integrated schools and using the funds from those schools to promote a segregated system. Ultimately, this system collapsed on itself, and it was struck down by the federal district court as unconstitutional, and that was in 1959. In 1957, the Little Rock 9 incident in Arkansas occurred, where Governor Orville Faubus tried to prevent the integration of Little Rock High School, and again, the Supreme Court steps in to prevent this from happening, as well as Eisenhower, who uses the Nationalized Guard to enforce integration in that high school. And after that, in a sort of overlapping stage, you see token compliance, in which, like in Little Rock, there are only a few students that are admitted into white schools. And they do this through a process of pupil placement, and this happens throughout the South, where there's a pupil placement board which accepts applications from Black students and families to attend white schools. However, this is followed by all these bureaucratic delays. It's very difficult for Black students and families to apply to white schools, but ostensibly they are making a good faith effort to integrate schools. However, because of the informal social controls, especially in the South, where the Jim Crow past really was still enforcing de facto segregation in many places, it was very difficult for Black families and students to use the court mechanisms and to make complaints against school systems because they faced retaliation. They faced eviction, as Wilkinson points out, eviction, bodily harm through bullying students, firing. They faced a slew of social consequences if they were to try to apply to a white school or if they were trying to take a court case against a school system. And so through this token compliance, Black students really paid the price for this gradual approach because the few Black students that did attend white schools were retaliated against, as I mentioned, and they also felt the responsibility to achieve at a certain level and to represent the whole Black race. So this token compliance ends with the passage of the Civil Rights Amendment and the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. And the Civil Rights Amendment really changed the force behind the judicial, the court-enforced desegregation, because with the legislative branch in favor of desegregation integration, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare passed guidelines for schools to meet. And if they didn't, Wilkinson notes that these schools faced defunding, federal defunding, which was a serious issue. So from 1964 to 1966, you see in 1964 there's 2.3% of Southern Black students attending desegregated schools. And in 1966, according to Wilkinson, 12.5% of Black students are attending white schools. So there's a huge jump. And this is largely attributable to the Civil Rights Amendment and the guidelines from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. So during this time, there is modest integration. And in 1966, the Coleman Report, and I'll cite a few findings from that report now, is conducted in line with the Civil Rights Amendment, which required a comprehensive study on the state of American schools. And it found that schools are still largely still segregated, and also that there's a huge difference in the achievement between segregated and integrated schools. Integrated schools achieved a lot higher, and also that Black schools typically had inferior facilities. Their faculty often had less education, and they had less extracurricular activities. Just overall, their facilities, it reinforced the idea that separate was unequal. And this really fueled the next stage, which was massive immigration. And the court case that really exemplified this and really pushed it forward was the 1968 Green versus the New Kent County School Board case. And in this, Daniel Amsterdam gives a brief overview of that case when he says in his paper on the resegregation of Southern schools that in 1968, this Green decision set a new standard for the desegregation of schools by requiring that segregation be eradicated in student school assignments, the distribution of faculty, the distribution of staff, access to transportation, provision of extracurricular activities, and school facilities. So we go from the vague language of Brown versus the Board of Education to this very specific language in the Green decision. And following this, you see a huge deluge of court cases. In between 1969 and 1970, Wilkinson collects data on the number of cases on desegregation in the Fifth Circuit, and there were around 166 cases between these 2 points. So with this new standard in the Green decision, the courts really take a hold and move forward with desegregation integration. And there's a period of massive integration in this point. However, in the 1970s and onward, there was pushback against this, and the process of resegregation occurs. The Reagan administration really rejects this idea that the court holds a remedial position, and in a paper on the school choice and transition, Gurwitz talks about how the Reagan administration really started off with a position against court-ordered desegregation and in favor of the courts being reined back and school choice being the main mechanism. And then in 1992, Daniel Amsterdam points out a turning point in terms of resegregation, in which this Freeman versus Pitts decision in 1992, in which Justice Kennedy's majority decision states that that de facto segregation essentially is not something that school systems can be held liable for. This really sets the stage for resegregation into the present day, and where de facto residential segregation and social stratification really dictates how school systems are operated. And Amsterdam also points out that the federal judiciary's retreat from school desegregation meant a termination of court oversight, and that the ending of programs like busing that really helped desegregate schools temporarily. But after the passage of after the decision of Freeman and Pitts, these systems fell apart. So why did it fail? I think it's really important to note that the vague language in Brown versus the Board of Education really set them up for failure, and that there was, after this vague decision was handed down, there was a lack of uniform application. There was localized desegregation, but it was never uniform until the health and education welfare standards were passed down. And still, even after that, there wasn't really uniform application. Also, the third really big factor is that Southern resistance to segregation really impeded any integration attempts. So in the modern day, we see the manifestation of segregation primarily through charter schools and tracking. So you see segregation within schools and see segregation between schools. And there are a few simple measures from the policy side that can be used to ameliorate these segregation problems. First, the promotion of charter schools through the Race to the Top program and the current administration's position on charter schools should be ended, because Rothberg, in a paper titled "The Charter Schools and the Risk of Increased Segregation," notes that there is inherently issues with the design of charter schools that create segregated conditions in terms of race, ethnicity, income, and also religious affiliation and special education needs. Because charter schools are more specified and they're designed for a specific population, they often promote segregated standards. And with the proliferation of charter schools, there's a serious problem with the amount of segregation that occurs because of them. And although this is an issue, because these charter schools can be designed in specific ways, it is important to note that they can be used to improve the diversity of schools. And in school choice and segregation, Tomika Davis points out that in certain schools, certain magnet schools that promote a decreased level of segregation and promote diversity, that there was increased access to higher level, or not higher level education, but higher level courses for Black students. So it is important to note that although school choice is a problem because of the way they're designed, it can also be used in terms of desegregating and integrating schools. And another one of the interesting things to point out in that regard, because oftentimes school choice leads to segregation based on socioeconomic status, in that same paper by Rotberg, they found that 80% of the variance in performance could be explained by socioeconomic status. So if you can eliminate that as a point of segregation, you can really get at the desegregation of schools, and you can really improve the level of integration in United States schools. And the other serious issue to look at is the tracking system in the United States. And tracking gives white parents the opportunity to limit contact between races, according to Tomika Davis in her paper on school choice and segregation, because it allows students that are higher achieving, but also that have access to outside resources, which white students increasingly or disproportionately do in comparison to minorities. This gives them an advantage in terms of tracking into higher courses. And because of this, the access to higher level courses is limited for minorities. And in that paper by Davis, they found that this access to high level courses was really important in the level of achievement. And that by improving access to higher level courses, you can improve achievement in those schools. So first and foremost, it's important to lower the level of encouragement for charter schools and change the level of the policy on the level of legislation, the level of regulation of private schools, charter schools. This can be changed, and charter schools can be used to improve diversity instead of increasing segregation. Also, tracking needs to be changed, the tracking system, so that all students have an equal opportunity to access higher level courses. As you can see through the history of desegregation, there have been many failures, and into the modern era, you can see that charter schools and tracking are serious issues in terms of promoting segregation in American schools. Addressing these two issues has a lot of potential to decrease the level of desegregation and improve achievement levels. As Coleman pointed out, there's a great potential for integration to improve our schools in the United States. Thank you for your time.